Thank you, everyone, for coming to this week's CHEP seminar. We're fortunate to have Dr. Rosalie Pacula here to speak with us. She comes from the RAND Corporation. She's an expert on the economics of substance abuse and addiction, since she's written on youth addiction as part of her dissertation, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Today, and she's also an expert on medical marijuana laws, relatedly. And today, she's published in some of the top journals of economics, AEJ Policy, Journal of Health Economics, and also top health policy journals, Health Affairs, Health Services Research, the American Journal of Public Health, all the JAMAs. We're all incredibly jealous.
Yeah, I'm getting
You're pretty damn close. So today, she's here to speak on ethnic differences in quick responses to legal protections of medical cannabis dispensaries. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for inviting me. And I'm feeling very guilty because Joe has invited me to come participate as a listener in these sessions for a very long time. And given I live so close, it's really horrible that I haven't done this. And I will try to do this more often before I move to LA. But we'll get there. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think a few of you guys have probably heard a little bit about medical marijuana having worked here. You might wonder, why is this an interesting question? What am I talking about in terms of de facto versus de jure related to marijuana markets? And I will get to that question. Let me start with, for many of you, you're fully aware, this has been an area of a lot of policy change over time in our recent years. 1998, we only had 3 states that had what are today recognized as medical marijuana laws. And I say today because the definition of a medical marijuana law has actually changed over time. The first laws recognizing the therapeutic value of marijuana passed by states passed right after the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. Shortly after marijuana got scheduled as a Schedule I drug, states immediately responded, and the scientific community immediately responded and said, wait, marijuana is nowhere near as dangerous as heroin and cocaine. Why is it Schedule I? And there's actually a big push with the 1972 Schaefer Commission to change the status of marijuana in the original scheduling of the Controlled Substance Act. And states anticipated this and started passing laws recognizing the therapeutic value. None of them provided medical necessity defenses to patients. They allowed for a therapeutic research program, which was very restrictive. A couple states actually, in their state Controlled Substance Act, rescheduled marijuana. That really doesn't do anything because this doctors get their licensing for writing prescriptions from the federal government, so changes in the state law were just symbolic. So then we have, starting in 1996 with California, early 1990s, adoption of these medical marijuana laws, which provided a medical necessity defense to patients, and had at the same time decriminalization. Decriminalization also started shortly after the scheduling of marijuana as a Schedule I drug. But you can see in these 3 maps how the laws have continued to evolve and change just in the recent history. There's a liberalization of marijuana policy that has occurred. From decriminalization, medical marijuana, to commercial legalization. And it's important to know, decriminalization is really only about penalties associated with possession and use of the substance. It says nothing about the legal supply of cannabis. Why is that important? Because decriminalization is a policy that is expected to change the user risk and the user cost of using, but have no impact on the production cost of marijuana. So decriminalization policies, which have been happening since the 1970s, aren't expected from an economic standpoint to impact the price of marijuana except through demand shift. There's no impact on the cost of production. Medical marijuana laws did something a little different because they allowed for a legitimate legal supply that evolved over time, and I'll be talking about that. And so it allowed for legitimate supply under certain circumstances, changing the production cost, the legal risk of production and supply under those circumstances, but in a small way. Commercial legalization is a much bigger change because it's opening the market, allowing for supply under federal prohibition to anybody who gets a license. So it should have a bigger impact on the market. While people have talked about decriminalization and medical marijuana, the actual policy variation that exists across the state is quite more than just those 3 policies. I like to show this graph for a couple of reasons. Lots of people are shocked to see the yellow states. Probably not your students, because you're aware. Joe knows this as well as I do. Starting in 2014, several states trying to reduce the pressure to adopt these so-called medical marijuana laws started passing an alternative hybrid law called high CBD laws. These are laws that allow for patients within these states to only have products that contain high amounts of cannabidiol, which is one of the many cannabinoids in cannabis that is found to have therapeutic benefits. But they also have a requirement of having low THC, no more than 3% THC. These states, in yellow here, are not recognized by advocacy groups as medical marijuana states because they don't allow all forms of marijuana to be produced and sold to patients. Well, that's a problem. I mean, it's true in the standpoint that no product is available, any product is available, but there are some products that are available in these high CBD states. So depending on the research question that you're asking, if you want to know about social norms and how do people view the therapeutic value of cannabis and how important is that impact of social norms on, say, youth use, you might care about these high CBD laws that are passed by state legislatures because they're saying, yes, this plant in certain forms does have therapeutic value. If you're worried about high potency cannabis, THC, which is the main psychoactive ingredient that we know of the 120 cannabinoids that exist in the plant, then these laws are less important. And advocacy groups also don't like them because they're limited and too narrow in the range of medical products that are allowed. Nonetheless, if you're going to do a difference in difference estimation, our preferred method for causal inference in evaluating these laws, and you're looking at norms or access, you should test the sensitivity of your model to the inclusion of these alternative states that people haven't been paying attention to. So that's one of the first things I like to point out. The second thing I like to point out when I show this map is that there's how many white states here? Hardly any. These are the only states where there's a true prohibition. So if you want to know about the impact of legalizing marijuana recreationally, vis-a-vis prohibition, those are your only control groups right now. That's not how these studies get estimated. It's important to understand every single state that has gotten to the point of full legalization passed through a commercial medical market first. So the changes that are observed in studies that evaluate the impact of going from medical marijuana to recreational marijuana is an epsilon change from a commercial medical market. We'll get to see a little bit more of what's likely to happen with, Vermont has just gone to a commercial market that is, just went to a recreational market that is not going to be commercialized.
What do you think's holding up Idaho at this point?
Yeah, I think it's, they're a little worried about the Oregon. They've had a lot of traffic going over from Oregon, and they were also, what's really odd about Idaho is they were the minimum legal drinking age of 17 or 18 for the longest time. They were the holdout. So it's an interesting question. So those were the main things I wanted to make sure that you recognize when you're talking about this.
So what is your, there's been some discussion, right, about the different types of medical marijuana laws and which types of laws have led to the most sort of spillovers on the supply side to the recreational market, whether it's home cultivation of marijuana, you can grow lots of plants at home for multiple patients and so on. So what is your sense across those different types of laws, and which has been most important for the sort of the spillovers to the non-medical market?
So my thinking on this has evolved quite a bit. If you've read my work, you'll know, I know Joe has. Initially I thought it was any legal supply chain that was allowed. Home cultivation, that's a supply source. You can grow it at home. College students have been doing this for years in their dorms. Now you're allowing it in any home. That's going to be really important for the market. And in fact, but we aren't seeing huge effects of home cultivation on the spillover effects to recreational. Where we're seeing it is in commercialized markets. Now I say commercialized, I didn't say allowed dispensaries. Second stage of my research was, well, okay, it's about the storefronts. It's the fact that there's a store and that's become normalized. So that's legitimate access. Well, if it's only one store and it's a mom and pop store, it's probably not going to have that much of an impact on a community's fabric or on general thinking about the product than if it's a Walmart supercharged or a Starbucks on every single corner. And if you look in this literature, the economists are a little slow about this, but we keep talking about market, and it's not just the presence of a market is now allowed. We have to be thinking about this as a new market that's emerging, and at what point does it reach a threshold where it is now commercialized? I'll be talking about this point in a minute when I talk about the laws. So I'll stop there, but it's evolving. And so I've been accused, and I can understand this logic, I'm just fishing for something that will show a bad effect of marijuana. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand a market that was illicit, that had a footprint illicitly, existed. People know where to go to get it. What was the major barrier to it? Information, where to go. Some people had that information, not everybody. And competition. Allowing stores to exist when there are other stores that, or other means of use. We did a study across the 4 states that were all medical, New Mexico, Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. Before opening of the commercial recreational stores and after. These were places where people could go and get cannabis from dispensaries beforehand from the commercialized medical market. The household population said they were actually not buying from dispensaries. They were getting it from friends, the social network, because of the holdover of the illicit market being more of a social network point of access. It wasn't until dispensaries started competing in advertising and commercializing and a huge innovation in product that you start to get more of the commercial hardcore impact of the market. And when you assess the impacts of that on some of the youth outcomes, it's different than just the fact that the law passed or a dispensary opened. And so it's an emerging market is what I think is the story now.
How do they differentiate from illicit market? How do they differentiate the product?
How should they differentiate? So this is, if I could get the people in Sacramento to listen to me, Vermont, I've tried, they're listening a little better. If you're going to legalize this market and try to get revenue from it and still impose a higher tax and licensing fee, so it's more expensive to be in the legal market than it is to continue to be black market, how are you going to get that market to thrive? By ensuring quality. This is a known product. We know that there's no pesticides. We know that there's no mold. So if you have any compromised immune conditions, you can trust our product. And you know if you eat this much, you will still be able to function. It's not going to impair you to the point where you're stuck on the sofa for the next 4 hours. So that sort of knowledge about the product and the quality of the product, the mode of administration and the safety of it, information is, I think, what would make a legal market far more competitive than the black market. Wines, how do fancy wines attract drinkers? You pay more for a fancy wine. You convince them there's something about the product that's more useful, better flavor, better whatever. We can do that if that's what we focus on. Right now we're just focusing on getting rid of the black market. It's a race to the bottom. Because we're not going to get rid of the black market. We have a black market for cigarettes. We have a black market for alcohol. If the goal is to get rid of the black market, we're not going to get it. We should focus on delivering to the consumer a safe, high-quality product. Okay, let me get into de facto versus de jure, that component of it. So there's been lots of interest about the impact of these policies. One of the areas of interest is on the racial discrimination that has existed with respect to our drug laws. We do know that our drug laws have been more aggressively enforced against minorities for a variety of reasons. But with legalization, we should have a reduction in this disparity. There's also a lot of interest on the impact of these laws on use, lots of evidence. I work with people in this room, the impact of prevalence and frequency of use with respect to adults. Generally, the evidence is pretty consistent that there is a positive effect of these medical marijuana laws specifically, even on recreational use, measured in different ways. In the case of youth, the evidence is far more, I would say, mixed. Some people say it shows no effect. There's reasonable reasons to disagree on that because, in essence, if you're looking at the presence of a law, there's either no effect or actually medical marijuana laws could look to be protective against youth. The question is how you operationalize that medical marijuana law, and then that's where the mixed findings come in, or the targeted population. High-risk youth tend to increase use in certain types of medical marijuana states. I say that, high-risk youth. Who do you think of when I say high-risk youth? Criminal injustice involved? Deviant? Guess what? There are also a lot of ethnic minorities. There's a lot of overlap that you're going to see. It's unclear, though, if these changes in prevalence rates for adults, so let's just start with adults. If these changes in prevalence rates in adults is due to an increase in the number of people coming into the stock of users, or a decrease in the rate of people leaving use, because prevalence is a static measure, but it's capturing two different dynamics. And the dynamics have not yet been carefully studied. Why should we care about the duration of use? Why is that important? Because a lot of the health implications of cannabis, the acute use of cannabis, the acute effects of cannabis, are largely related to how much are you consuming and what quantity, and acute psychoses. Okay, those are possible health effects for certain products, particularly with naive users. But the real concerns about cannabis that I've seen in the literature relate to longer-term use, longer-term health implications, both in terms of respiratory problems, primarily bronchitis. Dependence is clearly a factor associated with duration of use. Cognitive impairment. Now, I'm not talking about the gray matter, and there's the bench science being done at UCSD, but actually there's been several studies looking at ability, school performance, and there new work looking at the brain and at the cannabinoid receptors in the brain, the areas in which the CB1 is one of two cannabinoid receptors in our body, CB1 and CB2 that we know about right now. CB1 is the receptor for THC largely. There are CB1 receptors in our brain, not just in our pleasure areas, that is where we have our opioid receptors as well. But we have CB1 receptors in the areas of our brain that affect memory and cognition, which is why some users who use chronic cannabis over long periods of time, we now know a mechanism in the brain, it's the area of the brain that the CB1 receptors are, that makes for the natural mechanism that then carries into these studies where we're seeing chronic users showing impairment in cognitive functioning.
I'm guessing that some of these health issues differ along with the modes of transmission of the marijuana. Like I would assume edibles would be kind of safer in that sense. So is there any type of, like, are edibles the safest marijuana to consume? Would that be safe to say?
Absolutely great question. We don't have a clue what the answer is yet. The work is going on in the field right now. Mode of administration has important implications, not just on potential health effects. I mean, obviously the most obvious, smoking versus edible, right? It's no different than vaping, e-cigarette versus tobacco cigarette. So we have a lot that we still need to learn. The obvious ones are obvious, but things like how long does impairment last and what part of impairment is most affected. One of the things they're finding with edibles, one of the negative side effects of edibles, is the cardiac effects, because people can overconsume very quickly, and there are now cardiovascular events that are associated with edibles. Does that mean that it's bad? No, it just means we have to figure out what the right dose is. It goes back to what is an appropriate dose, and we just haven't done that work yet. It's coming, I hope. So we know from the alcohol and tobacco field that the impact of policies on initiation are actually different than the impact of these same policies on quitting. And so the question is that true for marijuana? No one's looked at this. And that's what we're trying to do in this paper. Our first contribution is to say, what did this liberalization policy, and we'll focus on medical marijuana for reasons I'll explain very soon, what does that do to the length of time that people are using? Quitting is going to determine, once you're starting, it's your decision to quit, that's going to influence your duration. And there's health implications of this that we care about, as well as potential risks, legal risks.
Just in terms of stylized facts, as we sort of think about when sort of the take-up is sort of most likely with tobacco and sort of one's teen years, what do we know about sort of take-up of marijuana and when most quitting sort of happens?
I will show you data from the NLSY, which is one cohort, but fundamentally, quitting, most initiation happens by the age of 16 to 17. Average age of initiation has been declining. Quitting has, on average, happened in most countries. The bulk of the quitting happens by age 30. What we don't know is, like, at what point does half of the using population quit? Because initiation can continue well into young adulthood. When some quitting stopped, you'll see in our data, our average quitting is around age 20, which was a lot younger than what I was expecting.
How are you defining quitting here with cannabis use? It seems clear when you have a physiologically addictive substance like tobacco or alcohol, but with cannabis, it's not clear that...
That's a really good question. So we're relying on the nature of the longitudinal data that we have, NLSY, where we have 15 waves of data. We have them from age 12 to 16 all the way to age 32. So when we see somebody quit, and then they aren't using 1 year later, and they aren't using 2 years later, and our sample ended, we say they quit for good. Now that could be wrong. We have a measurement error here, and that's a valid concern. But the question of whether people could enter and exit this market after a 3-year exit is a really valid question. We don't see a lot of that in our data, but again, we have a single cohort where a lot of change is happening, so I don't know if that is going to be reflective of use behavior 10 years from now or 10 years ago. It's a fair question, a legitimate. This is not a study that I would put all the policy on. This is a study that I hope will cause people to say, I want to see if I get that from a decade ago or two in other data sets. It needs replication.
Does the legal protection of retail markets, does that have an effect of reducing the price of marijuana?
Absolutely. Competition and the reduction of legal costs. And I'll show you the simple model for that. So the first is based, like I said, the first contribution of our paper is looking at duration. The second is it describes this early evolution of the marijuana policies from the framework of markets. Because it's not just about a law passing, but we want to think about markets opening. And does it matter? We lived in California. Most of us who are here are Californians. We had a very funky policy where in 1996, we allowed for patients to use with medical necessity. In 2004, which is a good 8 years later, we legally sanctioned dispensaries. Many of those dispensaries actually operated before we passed the 1996 law in the San Francisco Bay Area. So dispensaries existed, but they weren't legally protected. We'll call that de facto legalization. And then you have other states where the law passed for medical marijuana, New Mexico, it took 2 years for the rules regarding dispensaries to get developed and for the first dispensary to open. So when the law passed, technically they were allowed, but no dispensaries existed until 2 years later. That's de jure. Now technically we're measuring it when the law passed, which is not ideal. You would want to do it when they're open. I have other states that do that. I'll tell you why in this study we're not. So then the third thing is that we're differentiating the impact of these two types of market on behavior for the first time. And we're looking at the differences in race ethnicity. So here's an outline of where I'm going. I'm already taking longer than I expected, so I will keep going. Basically, I'll give you the evolution of the laws for anybody who hasn't been as tracking this as carefully as some of us have. I'll give you a little bit of theoretical framework for why de facto markets might influence behavior differently than de jure markets, and then go through the data. So I think the best way to understand the history is just to look at the laws themselves. And these are data that we started collecting. Actually, this data started getting collected back in 1998 with decriminalization policies before we even had many medical marijuana laws as part of what was called the Impact Teen Initiative. It was a Robert Wood Johnson funded initiative to try to collect information at the state and local level around the monitoring of future communities so we could link policies to youth use in these communities. We struggled to find a senior investigator that was interested in tracking illicit drug laws, and marijuana at that time was one of those illicit drug laws because it's federally prohibited. Why would the states do anything? And I had already done a little work on my dissertation on decriminalization. I'm like, but there's variation in decriminalization. Isn't it possible there could be more? Peter Reuter said, hell no. I don't know if you guys know Peter Reuter, but he just won the Stockholm Prize in criminology. He didn't think state law was going to matter. He wasn't interested in leading it. John Calkins, who is at Carnegie Mellon, very bright guy. Both Peter and John are very good friends of mine. Both of them are my mentors. And I couldn't convince them to do this. So we had other people who get involved. And we started tracking the laws. And in doing this, you could see right away as the laws started getting adopted. As an economist, I was interested in the markets. Other people on the project were sociologists and public health officials and patient registries, which seemed like a very logical way to identify who had legitimate access to the market was an important part of these policies. So we started tracking that in home cultivation because nobody was opening dispensaries when these laws first passed. They allowed primary access to medical marijuana through these initiatives was home cultivation or through NIDA or law enforcement seized through criminal activity. So those latter two weren't very common, so home cultivation was really the main access. Now, one of the things I want you to see right away, DC is a little different because it's DC and in the middle of the federal government, but look at Washington State. Everybody right away recognized Washington State in 1998 as a medical marijuana law. In Washington State, in order to gain access to the marijuana, you had to get it through NIDA or through law enforcement. There was no home cultivation allowed. There was no home cultivation allowed in Washington State ever until they legalized recreationally, at which point they still don't allow home cultivation. Why is that important? Maryland, 2003. Was this the email exchange that you and I had? So 2003, Maryland legislature passed a law recognizing the medicinal value of marijuana. It did not specify a source of supply. It was signed by the governor. It is not recognized by NORML or the Marijuana Policy Project as a medical marijuana state. Why? Because by 2000, they started seeing we need a source of supply. They changed their definition of a medical marijuana law. They decided a medical marijuana law that they would recognize, a modern medical marijuana law, had to have a legitimate source of supply. Okay, that actually is a very reasonable definition, but then take Washington State out, and it's not taken out. We have continued to collect our data because we continue to see that advocacy groups who have a politically minded mission, no fault, they're allowed to have that, change their definition over time in what is a functional policy. We as researchers can't have a policy changing over time in order to analyze its effect. We need to know how it's changing and document that change. So that's why we have continued our database. And you can define our database any which way. If you want to use one that's a policy that includes a legitimate source of supply, you can use our data set and do that and get most of them get close to the advocacy groups. Washington is my little bone convention. So these are the early laws. None of them allow for dispensaries. The reason why was because of the federal prohibition and the uncertainty regarding how the federal government would respond to these states. There was federal raids in certain states of some growers, in particular, some patients who had 100 plants or more. Some people would consider them growers, but they called themselves patients. So there was a real legitimate federal risk associated with these policies. The states were not sure if the federal government would sue them. The states have to balance their budget every 2 to 3 years by law. Lawsuits with the federal government are expensive. They didn't want the extra costs. So they specify their laws in a way that protects patient rights, but keeps them out of trouble from the federal government. That's good for the states. By the way, does this matter? Yes. 90% of people who get charged with a drug possession offense are tried in state courts. It's state law that they face. The criminal penalties of state law. Then you have Obama becoming elected president. Shortly after he's elected president, his Attorney General, Eric Holder, in February, very quickly says his office, Department of Justice, is not going to make enforcement of medical marijuana a major priority in states that are where patients are and growers are operating in compliance. That gets formalized October 19th, 2019, in what has become known as the Ogden Memo. David Ogden, who was the assistant deputy attorney, wrote a memo to all federal prosecutors saying this is not a priority. As long as states, as long as patients and growers are complying in unambiguous terms with the state policy. Well, if you're ambiguous in your source of supply, it's hard to be in clear, unambiguous compliance with state policy. So states start modifying their laws and becoming more specific in how they will allow for supply of cannabis. This is a response to the federal government. And it wasn't just new states adopting new laws. Previous states that had laws on the books, I have DC here, had a law on the book, it wasn't being enforced. Maryland would also be here, become more explicit post the Ogden Memo. I only show through 2011 because the data that I'm going to be showing you on use and quitting only goes through 2011, okay?
So there's been arguments about the patient registries sort of having a protective effect, making sure marijuana is only getting to the hands of those who need it most for medical reasons. What's your reading on that?
So you don't see a lot of required patient registries early on because of the sphere. The federal government could then come and take the registry and charge these people. Post the Ogden Memo, it actually becomes a lot more common. This is the earlier years of the post-Ogden Memo. I am not aware of a case where that happened. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen because I have not gone through all the states to know. But there was a huge expansion in the number of registered patients post the Ogden Memo. So patients were themselves less willing to go get a card until the federal government said we won't intervene. So there was a perceived legal cost associated with that. Okay, so post Ogden Memo, which is again 2009-2010, that's when you start seeing more specific regulations of these so-called markets, the dispensaries. Prior to that, even though we had California passing allowances for dispensaries in 2003, effective in 2004, there was no specifics provided on those dispensaries. They pushed all of that down to the local communities because they didn't want to set something up that put them at federal risk. That was true in Maine initially, but 2009, you now are in the Obama era. And then after that, you get a lot more specificity about what's going to be allowed in these legal markets. That's important for two reasons. That's how you get California and Colorado's wild, wild west. Dispensaries all over the place, no licensings, no caps, because they weren't set up. It wasn't because they wanted the Wild West. They didn't predict that by any means. They were trying to protect the businesses and consumers within their states. Post the Ogden Memo, these states that adopted dispensary systems are fundamentally different. They actually regulated them. They actually checked on them. This is a more restricted environment than the initial states. So that's where we're getting some of the identification here in our model. The de facto legalization is a combination of two things. These are dispensaries that existed without legal protection. They weren't necessarily everywhere at this point in time though, because there were still federal raids. They didn't go crazy until after 2009. Los Angeles had its proliferation of dispensaries post the Ogden Memo. They didn't have that many dispensaries before 2009 because there was still this federal risk. Same with San Francisco. So after that, you have states being involved in setting up the market, regulating the market, and that took time for the market to evolve. Those are de jure states. This is a look at the implementation of the dispensary post, well, it's for our time period. Again, you have up through basically here is pre-Ogden because our data, based on our data, we don't have much data post the Ogden period. Legally protected dispensaries comes in most of our states about, with the exception of California, Rhode Island actually had its late dispensary rule. Maine, but Maine, this is post-Ogden. Most of these legally protected dispensaries come in later. And then we did a search. It's really easy to find when the first dispensary opened in a state that was regulating its dispensaries because there was an application and a license, and you can find out when it opened because it made the news. It's much harder in the earlier ones. So we had to do a whole bunch of web crawling. We looked at advocacy groups, Normal Marijuana Policy Project, as well as weed maps and price of weed, a few other sources, going back on the Wayback Machine to identify whether or not dispensaries were open within the state. And so there's some measurement error, we're sure, in some of our dates for active dispensaries. We feel reasonably comfortable with the year, less comfortable with the month that we're saying that's there. Okay? So, I've made the point of how I've defined de facto versus de jure, and that's how we're going to be defining some of the difference in these markets. Now, why do I think that they differ? Fundamentally, we know medical marijuana can affect, or theoretically, we believe it can affect use, recreational use of marijuana through a couple different mechanisms. First, it's going to impact the price because it reduces the legal risk of supplying to particular patients. And with states that don't require a patient registry, you can say you're supplying in the medical market, and there's no way of proving whether or not you're supplying in the medical market or you're not supplying in the medical market because there's no patient registration. It hasn't been done carefully or regularly in the early markets. There's a second way that legally protected dispensaries should affect the cost of using, and that is through the non-pecuniary price. Price is a pecuniary aspect of cost. It's measurable, but it largely reflects the cost of production, right? And then equilibrium between supply and demand. But in the case of illicit goods, there's also non-pecuniary costs associated with, largely reflecting search costs and legal risks. Once dispensaries become legal, allowed, you can go and find out where they are. It's in your Sunday regular, it's in your billboards, you know exactly where to be. Search costs get reduced, and the legal risks of using and possessing go down. Now, price falling should not differentially affect any group, right? Supply, the cost of producing marijuana affects all users the same when it drops, to the extent that we have a law of one price in a market that's built exactly one price.
Well, there still could be differential access to credit markets. Like if you want to get into
yes.
business, you know,
That's a
if
very good point.
you might not get loans as easily if you belong to a minority.
I would argue that gives me a conservative estimate of my impact on race ethnicity, I think. That's a good point, I hadn't thought about that. The costs for search should also be completely the same. The legal costs, theoretically, should be the same. But in fact, we know that they're not. So here's a very simple theoretical framework that I'm using. This is just to get you thinking about what is making up supply versus demand. So when I talk about the de facto versus de jure market, you're thinking about which mechanism. Obviously, price is a function of supply and demand. In the case of supply, supply is a function of the legal risk of the supplier, which if you are allowed to grow to provide for medicinal purposes, those risks are reduced with medical marijuana, not for illicit producers unless they can identify themselves as a medicinal supplier. You have the average risk of getting caught, which could vary depending on your location, and your penalties. S is supplier penalties. Penalties for supplying an illicit drug have always been higher than penalties for using in most of the states, okay? X is a function of all your costs of producing the market, and because this is not a perfectly competitive market, your supply is going to be a function of the size of the market. One of the factors that's influencing the size of your market is the state regulation that says how many competitors you're going to have, okay? So this is not like our usual price-taking supplier. On the demand side, and this is about duration user, so this is the side that we're worrying about. You have the price of the good, the legal risk to the user, which is a function, again, of the average risk of getting caught, which is not homogeneous in the population. The penalties, if you get caught, those are statutorily based, but if there's any prosecutorial discretion, that could be also changing. And then again, the size of the market is a function of the demand overall. So what I'm trying to do is see if de facto versus de jure markets differentially influences this legal risk to the user, not to the supplier.
I think it would be useful to add to the model besides the subscript J for which stands for the jurisdiction,
Yeah.
and T stands for the time. I would also add maybe a G for group, like, you know, is this person black?
To make it more explicit.
Or Hispanic or whatever, and it's not going to matter only what the group is for the user and what the group is for the seller, but also for the interaction. Because if in your jurisdiction there isn't much of a demand on the part of people who look very different from you, then being a drug seller is going to be more dangerous because you're going to stand out.
Yeah.
For example, that you need the subscript of group to be added into the model, I think.
I think that's a very good point. When I first did this, I hadn't thought about this. I mean, this was back in 2010, but you're right. I need to modify this now. So basically, getting back to this point of the legal risk, we know the risk of arrest is fundamentally higher for certain ethnicities. We've had lots of evidence that have demonstrated the discriminatory nature, racial discriminatory nature in arrests. But there's also this fact that females tend to be more risk averse. So what I'm focusing on is legal protection that's associated with du jour markets. Females, if they're more sensitive to legal risk, should be more responsive. It's not just about race ethnicity, but there should be a gender effect. So we want to explore that. And so that's where we're going with this. We're using the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, as I mentioned, 12 to 16-year-olds. And this is a single cohort that's aging. They're in 12 to 16 in 1997 when the survey got started. That's great because I have wonderful longitudinal data about them. I could look at the age of initiation as it's happening. I can look at quit and make sure that they did technically quit at least for at least a year, hopefully longer, which is all good. The bad news about this is 1997 when they were 12 to 16 years old. Now, Dory asked me this. Average age of initiation for marijuana was, you guys remember what I said? 16. So, medical marijuana laws started passing in 1996 with California, and yes, there was a flurry of activity in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but these guys are going to age out of initiation, which is why you're not going to see in this paper an analysis of initiation. I can't get at it. I wish I could. We have 15 waves of data, very high retention rate. So that's good. A lot of these people are staying in the sample, so 85% of the sample is still there by wave 15, which is 2011. That's my last year of data. Why is that the last year of data? Because starting in 2011, the Bureau of Labor Statistics decided this is a very expensive survey to do every year. We don't really need to collect this information every year. We'll collect it every 2 years. Makes perfect sense because the purpose of the survey is to look at the transition from school into the labor market. And by 2011, when these guys are much older, that's wrong. It's not, oh, well, it started at age 12. By 2011, they're late 20s and 30s. A lot of these people have already made that transition, so every 2 years makes sense. They decided 2013 they didn't need to ask about drug use. So there's no drug use questions in 2013. So I have a big break between 2011 and 2015 when they did ask about it. We don't use the 2015 data here, but we did check the 2015 data to see if people who said they quit were still quitting in 2015. So we still have a sensor problem. I'm not going to say we've solved that problem, but I feel like we did the best we could.
What is the question that they're responding to, and how does that correspond to how you're coding it in your data?
So we have, next slide. We asked them in the very first wave of the survey, have you ever used marijuana? And if so, what was your age when you first tried marijuana? Marijuana is the term that's used in the survey, so that's why I'm using it here. Then every wave afterwards, they ask, have you used each drug, marijuana being one of them, since the last interview? So in 2015, when they asked this question again, it was since the last interview. I don't have 2013 data, so there is this question. That's a legitimate concern. More importantly, those of you who played in the NLSY know, what's the average duration in the waves between NLSY year to year? It's not 12 months. It changes. Sometimes it's 9 months, sometimes it's 16 months, 14 months, so it changes over time. So we have to be careful when we're constructing attaching a policy date to the interview time, that we know when the prior interview took place. So when they say, no, I have not used since the last interview, that might have been 9 months ago, it might have been 14 months ago, and we have to look at the policy date as of that previous interview date to know what the policy was in the time period that they're reporting their use. So we're not looking at use, we're looking about did you quit. So if they said, yes, I've used it since my last interview, then we're coding them as still using, but they also ask, did you use the past month? So we know in the past month and they've used since the last interview. So we're using those two pieces of information to identify somebody who's still a current user.
But then, sorry, so then moving forward, if they say no, have they quit?
Only if they say no that time, and then every other time subsequently that we can see it.
Okay.
If they say no in 2011, and that's the first time they've said no, we code them as quit, but there's a risk that they haven't truly quit.
Have you tried any type of interpolation there?
Well, like I said, we've gotten the 2015 data and checked for consistency in the 2015 data. They didn't have them, I don't think, in the 2017 data, and so we have to wait for the next time. So we checked it as far as we could. We didn't interpolate, we just used the later waves of the survey to verify.
So I know it's not longitudinal in nature, but we talked earlier
This-
about the National Survey of Drug Use and Health.
Yes.
It's an alternative, so do they ask sort of historical information about quitting behavior at a
ask-
point that's...
Not about quitting, they just ask about age of first
I
use.
see.
So you can look at your current duration if they're still using, but you can't get at the quit choice.
Gotcha.
So it would be nice if they did. The nice thing about the data, like I said, is it has a bunch of individual personal health characteristics. Yeah.
Sorry. So with NLS survey participants who transitioned into the workforce, do
Yes.
they have job-related questions too?
Yes, they have a whole bunch of drug-related questions, including, well, no, they don't. NISDA has it, the drug testing. I don't think LSY has it.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was getting at, is I'm still a little skeptical about this notion of quitting.
Yeah.
But
That's fair. It's a fair.
But I mean, I think that true sort of quitting, reasonable interpretation of quitting behavior would be if you're employed in a drug testable type of job.
The vast majority of drug testing, though, occurs at the point of employment and not while currently employed, unless you're in a transportation job or a public sector job. The vast majority is only at the point of hire, and it's very easy to gain that.
Sure.
So, I think that, and a lot of people know that synthetic marijuana doesn't show up on a drug test either.
Yeah, but I mean, most people wouldn't really reasonably classify synthetic marijuana as marijuana, right? Isn't that the like crazy stuff that makes people like eat faces and such?
Unfortunately, yes, some people don't know that there's a difference and that it's fundamentally a different chemical. The same reason why kids don't understand vape pens can contain THC. User knowledge is not always that good. We don't have good public health information being provided to people. This is, the whole point here is to just basically demonstrate to you that we're able, and we don't in all of this, because duration model, we're looking at longitudinally over time, but we do have good information about the family background. You can tell I work with an Australian teen mom. They were raised by a teenage mother. Whether the mom and dad were present in the household when they were young, religiosity, which has been known to be very highly associated with substance use, income, household size, parental education, and the like. We're trying to get at general SES factors to the extent that we can. And then this is a very bad typo, standardized test scores, which is basically information. Both NLSY 79 and the 97 data has a basic IQ cognitive test that they take over time, which is information, good, useful information for tracking a lot of job market. This is what you're more interested in, or at least what I'm more interested in, the ever use of cannabis for the whole entire period. So these are very high rates because this is not when they're 12 and 16. This is over our whole 15 waves of data. Every use, we have about 60% of the sample reports ever using marijuana at some point during the time. Not that big of a difference between male and females, but females are a little bit less likely. You notice right away, Black and Hispanics, similar to females, are a little bit less likely than white. Quitting though, quitting rate is actually a little bit higher than the every use rate. This is among people who initiate. How many of them quit? Most people don't continue using for a long period of time. So it's very high quit rate. The average age of quitting is in the 20s, which is much lower than what I was expecting, because most of the research that we've seen in the US and in the longitudinal studies in Australia and New Zealand and even one in the Netherlands is that the average quit time is more along 28 to 30. So I don't know if this is something that's unique about this sample or not, but it's very different than what we know in other countries.
How do you handle the fact that this data is censored and that there are some people who never quit?
And that fundamentally we aren't capturing, they are zero, they aren't included in this average quit, they aren't in the denominator, so I'm missing them, and that might be part of the difference in calculation. That's a good point. Let's see what happens when we put in the never quitters. Typical duration of use was about 5 years, not that long, but you see right away that again there are ethnic differences in the duration of use.
Do you try any different or more like stringent codings of quitting use? I know that'll limit your sample, but say like they had for like a quit to equal one, they had to quit for like a few year span, like 3 successive.
Yeah, we did play a little bit with it. It didn't really matter because the problem is that, again, aging of this cohort. Most quitting effects is on average that we've seen in other locations is 27 and older. That's the tail end of what we're doing in terms of lifetime quitters. So we're seeing early quitters. Again, it's a flaw of the study and we should have replication on a longer survey.
Do you have any measure of the intensity of smoking?
We do have frequency of use, and we have looked at this for people who continue to report high frequency in the past month as our measure. The results are generally consistent. They aren't in this paper because we didn't look at the racial differences because the sample sizes start to get really low there, and so we had a hard time. We wanted to show this first, but in terms of the general effects on general duration, they're consistent, but I'll show you why that's problematic. You need to be able to look at the ethnic differences.
I'm also trying to wrap my head around the fact that you have an aging cohort, and then you've got these rollouts of commercial laws that
I'm
are
going to show you what that looks
by age too, right?
like. Yep.
Okay.
So let me show you what that looks like. This is the interaction of the law with quitting behavior, but this is what you're talking about in terms of your concern of the rollout of the law and the aging of the.
Well, that, but also the fact that the sort of prohibition still binds for these people like pre-21 in a lot of the states, right?
This is all medical marijuana. In 2011, no states have
I see.
done recreational marijuana.
Got it.
Now, I noticed that among the control variables in table A1 and A2, you don't have the person's own education. Is that because it's endogenous?
Yeah, it's still ongoing and we're worried about indoctrinating. We have some runs where we've included it. I just wanted to keep it out because of, it didn't matter for quitting. It wasn't a significant predictor.
It seems such an important variable just a
It's highly
priori.
correlated with parental education. So once we put in parental education, it was fine. That's part of the reason why we wanted that in there. What you can see here is I have here the hazard of quitting at a given duration of use, for where each duration is in years, and then the cumulative quitting. On the right-hand side is the likelihood of a medical marijuana law being adopted. This is any medical marijuana law, and this, again, for the cumulative number of medical marijuana laws over time. What you can see is that here we actually have good variation in the NLSY, or as our population is aging, we're getting states that are turning on, and we got quitting going on over the course of time, so we should be able to have sufficient variation to predict something meaningful here.
So am I interpreting it correctly that if they use it one time and don't ever again, then they're a user and then they quit? Is that right?
And that's why we have this big drop off
Right.
in the first year.
So if you sort of trim that coding
Yeah.
and say they're not a user unless they've used 2 consecutive years, are your results robust?
Our results are robust, but we don't show it, so maybe I should go ahead and pull that in.
It's probably idiosyncratic to me about this whole quitting thing, but
No, it's a fair point, because there's.
I would like to be convinced that it's not a trying it and then just this not continuing. That it's
Yeah.
The experiment.
Yeah, experimental.
Right, the
use,
experimental use, right.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So the model that I don't have with me that will convince you is that we had a version of the model where we had people who used for less than 5 years and people who used 5 years or more. And we separated the effects there. The general findings were indeed consistent.
And I think if you do what Clark suggests, then your average age of quitting could be much, later than 20.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so I understand your concern. We tackled it a different way, but I think we can tackle it your way and it would be the same. I'm showing you here the same trajectories, again, giving you a sense of variation, the hazard of quitting, and the adoption of states that have an operating dispensary. If you recall, there weren't that many, but we have people showing an increase in risk. Nobody is worried about that movers. We have people moving because we have these college-age kids. We actually have to be really concerned about that, and we do some sensitivity analyses associated with that. And then here's our legally protected dispensaries, where now you're getting much lower adoption of these legally protected dispensaries. Again, this is the nature of the time period we're looking at. But this is why, again, you can't really do much with initiation. But you can see we have some here. We have enough for identification. There's something going on with quitting in terms of variation when people are quitting. So that's important. Now what I'm showing you here are basically those cumulative distributions, but broken down males and females, and then by race ethnicity. And what you can see is that the whites, whether female or male, have a lower cumulative hazard, less likely to quit, because this is quitting again. Hispanics for females are high, and blacks are high. They aren't that different. They aren't statistically different. So in the case of females, there's a little bit of a difference early on, but not afterwards. Males, it is that we find later statistically significant. And here's just the hazards by race ethnicity. And here what I want to show you is in that first year, when there's just that experimenting going on, it's consistent across both gender and across ethnicity. So that, to the extent that it's a problem, it shouldn't be a problem in terms of our interpretation of the racial differences. Okay? Why we can't look at initiation, I was convincing you that we had good variation with respect to the other laws. Here we're showing you that, look, all that uptake in initiation happens well before the law's passed. Unfortunately, it's not the right data set for that. Okay, so what do we do to estimate the model? This is basically, we're estimating the quitting behavior, the likelihood of quitting, conditional on having use for a certain amount of time. So it's basically a conditional hazard model. We include in this information on our marijuana policy dimensions. Your alpha J here is your duration effect. And then I said we did do some other analyses with fixed durations. But we do this as a non-parametric proportional Cox model. When we estimate this, we allow for heterogeneous effects by interacting race ethnicity with our marijuana policy measures. And we're separating marijuana policy just in terms of any medical marijuana law, de facto operation of dispensaries, or de jure, and then our individual characteristics. Now, this looks like a different diff imported into a duration framework, which is what it is. And we still have the same concerns about differential pre-trends that we want to be careful about. So we do some of that study work to try to demonstrate that we don't have concern about pre-policy differences in trends. So here I'm showing you the results for the whole sample pulled together. Everybody, no differences in race ethnicity, although we do break it down by gender. If you look at everyone all together, you look at the effect of medical marijuana laws, or you look at the effect of operating dispensaries or protected dispensaries, voila, it doesn't affect duration and quitting behavior. These laws have no effect. Go ahead and legalize. Isn't going to change consumption at all. It's great. Females, no effect either. It's only when you look at males that we get that operating dispensaries have a slightly negative effect. Well, 22% reduction in the proportional hazard of quitting. That's because this is done as a hazard ratio, so this is a proportional effect. But really, that's a pretty big effect. Hey, you know, it's one result. How robust is it when we put the model a bunch of different ways? Should we be concerned?
And you also.
And I'm fishing for some significance here, right?
But you also threw out the people who never quit too, right?
Yes.
So that's.
So we have in here, in these models, the never quitters are still here. Oh, wait. So we're looking at the probability of quitting. And so the never quitters are in the denominator, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So here we start interacting it and looking at it by race ethnicity. Were we fishing for stars, or do we have a reasonable empirical question? I think that this is a very important and reasonable question because of the legal risk. But again, if you look across the full sample, males and females, and everyone, these are interacted, we see that medical marijuana laws, by in and of themselves, having any medical marijuana law saying nothing about the type of market, has no statistical effect on quitting behavior. In the pooled sample, doesn't for females. All of a sudden we get an effect for males, but that's because of the other interactions that are compensating. Case of operating dispensaries, we see that for whites, having operating dispensaries, de facto legalization, has a negative and significant effect, this is significant 5% level, on the likelihood of quitting. It reduces quitting among white males. It doesn't affect, well, it reduces the likelihood of quitting, increases, no, am I doing it? No, that's operating. Wait, that's positive. Hold on. Females, it's positive. It's driven by females for operating, sorry. So operating dispenser, it's more likely to quit if you're female. This is gonna look weird. I'll show you what this is. It's actually a difference between blacks, Hispanics, and white females. I'll come back to that in the sensitivity analysis. In the case of legally protected dispensaries, no impact at all on white males, but a negative and statistically significant effect on blacks and Hispanics. So, legally, and it's for males. Now, I'm glossing over the operating dispensaries for females. Give me a few minutes to get to why I did that. In the preliminary results, there was nothing going on at all with females at all, so I'll get to why I'm not worried about females right now. But in the case of males, where there was an effect, we're seeing here that the biggest effect is this weird offsetting finding. Legally protected dispensaries reduces the likelihood of quitting for black and Hispanic males, but not white males. Operating de facto de jure, just having a dispensary, decreases the likelihood of quitting for white males. Consistent with differences in costs. How robust is this? Well, first let me prove to you that I didn't have a problem with pre-trend, differences in pre-trends. This is showing you the results from our event study analysis where we include leads and lags of all the policies, first for any medical marijuana, there for operating and for laws providing legal protection. We do this simultaneously. These are not separate regressions. But you can see we have no pre-policy trend for any of our outcomes. So to the extent that this is a legitimate test of pre-policy trend differences in a duration framework, it's convincing, but I'm still not 100% if this is the right way to demonstrate.
So what is your explanation for the different effects for black and Hispanics versus white? Why is it that these different kinds of dispensaries have opposite effects on the two groups?
So operating dispensaries reduce search costs. They're there, you can find them.
But more so for whites?
No, not any more so for whites. But whites don't face legal costs in possession and use the way blacks and Hispanics do. The risk of legal arrests for possession and use are higher for minorities. So just because a store is there and operating, if it is not legally protected, there's still the opportunity for police discrimination and the enforcement of the law. It should be the same. If there were no discrimination or no differential enforcement, the impact of search costs, which we know is the same, legal costs should be the same. There should be no difference between groups.
I can also, that makes sense, but I can also think of another possible connection, that when there's a medical dispensary and it's not protected, if you know somebody who's a doctor, you have the network, we have a specialist on networks here, you can get a prescription to go and get yourself marijuana legally, but whites are more likely to have those kinds of networks that will allow them to get to the medical dispensary.
The problem is that with medical dispensaries, a lot of them had the doctors right there at the dispensary. It was not
You don't
done
need
that.
a doctor's
don't
prescription.
need
It was very easy to
That
get.
just shows you how
It's very easy
how
to
much
get.
I really know
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah, unlike an opioid, it's much easier to get permission to use marijuana. So this is a sensitivity analysis that I wanted to show you real quickly. The first column is our original specification that I showed you in column 3 before. In column 2, what we did was include state-specific time trends and race-specific time trends to understand, okay, maybe there was other things going on in law enforcement that was differentially discriminating against certain minorities. And when we include those, our effects on the minorities actually gets bigger. The effect is getting bigger in the second column in terms of the effect on quitting. You can see it right here. The third column, what we did was take out all the students who moved and changed states because we were worried about moves. Because you might want to go to a state that has medical marijuana for college. The University of Denver is becoming a very popular university. What does that do to our effects? We still have the same effect for blacks and Hispanics. And then the final specification, we try to tease out differential effects for blacks and Hispanics. Originally, when we did this analysis, we had estimated them separately as we dug into the data. And so this was the analysis that this last column was the main analysis that we had in most of our paper. The problem is this. LSY is nationally representative and has an oversample of blacks and Hispanics to try to increase the sample. Most of those people come from California. So when you start getting at the ethnic differences and you try to separate blacks from Hispanics, in the case of California, you're picking up a lot of the Hispanics. That's where you're getting most of your effects. So it's hard to know that the Hispanic effect alone is not a California effect. So we group them in this analysis in order to, the minorities in this analysis, to try to make sure that what our finding is not just a California finding. Okay?
Have you thought about ways to more explicitly sort of test if that's the story going on about just, you know, differential sort of changes in cost due to, you know, discriminatory practices in arrests? Are there sort of any geographic sort of variation in measures of discrimination that one can see, whether among blacks across these jurisdictions, whether there are these differential effects where you sort of expect them to?
Well, what if the stories found for these different types of laws on marijuana possession arrests? I mean, that would be the best place to go.
Yeah, that's right.
Uh-huh.
Have you used any of the arrest variables or anything like that?
Not in this analysis, although the analysis why I asked if you've ever been arrested, and we did include that as a potential control just to see what it did, and it didn't affect the quit behavior in terms of our finding overall, because the number of people in our sample that actually have been arrested is not huge. And we have an average effect here.
Why did you find the opposite effect for females?
Okay, so for females, this is all the blacks, those are all the males. I took it out, darn it. So for females, it goes, I don't have the picture, I didn't bring it with me. Basically, black females are very, very rigid. They're very unlikely to use marijuana. If I go all the way back here to my descriptive statistics. Here we go. Females. So this is just the quitting behavior. Black Hispanics are just as likely or more likely to quit. Our black females are just as likely or more likely to quit in medical marijuana states. That's not true for Hispanics, not true for white females. Very few black women initiate. Those who initiate, because there's so few, don't quit. They're different. So it's a different composition. There's a difference for black women. They fundamentally just operate differently than Hispanic or white women. And because we're grouping Hispanics and African Americans together, we're getting weird effects from the two of them.
Could it also be that there is different proportions of black women who engage in marijuana trade than for men? I mean, it might be a stereotype, but my understanding is that becoming a marijuana trader is more likely for men
I think that
than
what's
for
more
women.
likely is that African women are a lot more likely to be single-headed households, and so they take a big burden and less risk. They're more risk-averse, less risk engaging, I think is the most logical explanation, but I haven't empirically tested that.
I think I'm being dense here, but so what's the link here? Because you're studying dispensary protection, and the story that you're telling is about sort of risk aversion, right? That's where the differential effects are coming in, right?
It's legal risk.
Is it the expected
It's-
cost of
it's
consumption,
expected,
right?
No, expected risk arrest if you continue using.
Right.
So-
So the expected cost, like where arrest is random and
Influenced
risky.
by the
and
legal
so-
protection versus the non-legal protection of the
But how?
dispensaries.
That's the thing I think I'm being dense about. So how does protection of
The legal dispensaries,
sellers affect the expected cost of using for consumers?
okay, so with the legal protection of dispensaries, that primarily occurred with Ogden memo. That's where a lot of the variation is happening in this. And at that point in time, the federal government said, we will not aggressively pursue arrests for people who are in compliance with state law. So the perceived legal risk by communities who have been historically at greater risk of arrest was more dramatically changed with legal protection of the dispensary, because that has been legally protected under the state. So I'm going there just like anybody else, and it's legally protected, so I'm at no heightened risk than if it was just sitting there operating but not legally protected. I'm at greater risk as an African American or Hispanic going someplace that whites can go and get their marijuana just because I'm at higher arrest risk for possession.
It seems a little bit sort of circuitous. Like because there's been variation in possession decriminalization too. Would that not be the more direct way of testing
Actually, we
it?
have that in here as well.
Okay.
Reduction in the risk of arrest for possession of small amounts of marijuana. African Americans are still historically more likely to get arrested, even in decriminalized states, particularly youth.
But I guess my question would be, do you get a differential effect?
If you're at the race with the
Oh.
Supreme Court.
With the decrim,
Yeah.
we did that. I think this was obtained, but I don't have it with me. It's good. I will add that one back in as well.
All right, we'll take
I
a
know.
couple more. We're already over, so I don't want to.
I'm sorry. This
No,
is
no.
just the prediction of what the difference in quit rates would be if the top black line is no dispensary policies at all. The dash one is legally protected and operating, and that shows you the difference in likelihood of quitting for whites, blacks, and Hispanics predicted by the model.
I just had a question about the de facto dispensaries. Did you like track or control for what neighborhoods they were in? Like,
No, because this is all state level policy, and we have, and also we do have geocode. We could look. I mean, we
Because
could,
another story would be that those de facto dispensaries are in more white neighborhoods or mixed neighborhoods, so there's already less.
I don't think the NLSY data is the right data set to look. That's a great question. NLSY is not the best data to do it because you want it to be state representative within each of the states to be able to get at that appropriately. Lots of limitations. We've talked about some of these. Some of this is really a question of measurement error. So this is something that I do think that needs to be replicated. We have evidence from a single cohort, and there's this question whether or not this will be generalizable because of that. And the fact that the these dispensaries, these legally protected dispensaries, what that's done to the market has changed the medical markets post-Ogden memo. So whether what we found up to 2011 would hold in the future is a whole other question that should be explored. This is set in a particular time period, so our findings might be restricted to that time period. But fundamentally, basically what our findings support is that because ethnic minorities are at greater arrest risk, their behavior seems to be more responsive to legally sanctioned protections. Again, vast majority of these cases for possession are tried in state courts subject to state laws. So state protection is what they're responding to, not just the fact that the store is open. And the fact that if you don't pay attention to this, you get null findings, you see no effect of these laws. And I think that we as researchers need to pay attention to the heterogeneity in responsiveness to the changing of policies because of the differential experiences that we have. Could be potential implications for legalization. Right now we're seeing that it decreases the likelihood of quitting for certain minority groups. Is that a public health concern? Is that a concern? I don't think anybody can answer that question at this point because we don't have a clue what people are using, whether there's a difference in the products being consumed, the potency, how long the duration is. This is not anything that's going to answer any public health questions. It's just hopefully raises some interesting public health questions for the future. And I will stop there. That was going to be short, sorry.
Thank you.